Hi, everybody. David Nour back with you for another episode of the Service Council's inService podcast series. I'm delighted you're here. We're live on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter. Happy New Year. Hope your 2022 is off to a great start. I'm really excited to continue the relationship with John Carroll and Sheila Ahmad and the Service Council team. And I love hosting these series because you get a chance to speak with some phenomenal field service, customer executive leaders, and those who support their success globally. If you haven't had a chance to watch any of our previous episodes, I would encourage you to go back and watch. Boy, we had some great guests this past year, and we're really excited about continuing that this year. As a matter of fact, starting next month, not only Service Council launching a new website, but we're going to do 2 episodes a month. I believe it's on the first and third Thursday of each month, always noon Eastern. So hope you'll join us live on the various channels where we'll promote this. We'll also put show notes, blogs, turn these interviews into a blog posts. So I'd encourage you to check those out on the Service Council website as well. I'm elated that today our guest is none other than Gail Sease. Gail, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It is great to have you. Gail, for those who may not know as much about you, your background, could you start with a brief introduction and let us know kind of where you've been and what you've done to this point?
Sure. So, my background education is in communication management, and I have a master's in organizational communication. And about 3 years ago, I became a certified professional coach through IPEC, which stands for the Institute of Professional Excellence in Coaching. And so professionally, I think the best way to describe my career path has been this overlay of marketing, communication, and education on the services side of several industries, including construction, automotive, and the food equipment industry. And probably my expertise personally would be in the area of training, documentation, best practices, delivery.
Love it. Most recently, you spent some time at Hobart. So can you talk a little about that role?
Yeah, it was a great experience. Hobart, as you know, is owned by ITW, and it's one of the segments in their portfolio is food equipment. And so I spent almost 7 years there, and just recently left there to launch on my own for my coaching business. But what I did there is I came in managing a documentation team that was responsible for all the service manuals and parts catalogs for the company across 6 product lines. So it's pretty extensive from a project standpoint. And then almost 5 years ago, I assumed the training team as well. So I led both of those teams. And their exclusive focus was delivering training and documentation for about 1,500 field service techs across the US and Canada. And of course, we shared some of that training and expertise outside of North America in places like Asia and Europe as well. But that's where my team focused, and I led that team.
For our audience today, we're going to talk about mental health and the employee experience. And I would encourage you, whatever channel you're watching this, to jump in with your questions of Gail. It's an incredibly important topic as we continue to battle the ongoing challenges of this global pandemic and supply chain and people working remote and so on and so forth. So, Gail, talking about that, why is mental health and that idea of an employee experience so important to you personally and professionally?
Okay. So personally, I am a childhood trauma survivor, and I'm also what's considered an ACOA, which is an adult child of an alcoholic. And so with that comes a lot of mental health considerations. So it's definitely been a focus personally for me as I've grown and matured and really sought to achieve my own personal potential. But professionally, where I think it's very valid and relevant is that there's a lot of parallels between company culture and family culture. And if you lead people very long, you can see some of those parallels. And what's important about having a level of awareness about mental health when you're leading a team is that if you want to develop your team to their potential, you have to have some awareness about the role of mental health on your team, especially as it pertains to culture. And I've led probably at least 10 former military vets on my team in the last 7 years. And, I learned probably even a lot more about mental health from leading those individuals on my team, because there were some considerations that came with leading former vets. They deal with some different things that if you're not aware of it, it could create a bumpy experience for them in your organization. And then I think as the pandemic came along, it brought even a greater awareness than I already had.
And unless you tell me otherwise, I think this needs to go all the way even back to the recruiting. So, how do you incorporate kind of the mental health, either questions or conversations in that process? And then maybe certainly onboarding and then ongoing. It doesn't sound like a one and done event.
No, I would agree with that. I don't think, it's not been my experience personally that a lot of companies look at it from that holistic standpoint. But I think that it would be helpful if there was more engagement on the front end and understanding what maybe some of those challenges are. Now, I will tell you, ITW, I believe, does have a question on their application, at least within Hobart Service, that asks about post-traumatic stress. As far as actions that are taken from that, my experience is that I didn't know about those things until my team, that my employee in a one-on-one perhaps may have shared those things with me as part of understanding a better way to lead them. Not all of them discuss that, but I had that experience.
And you brought up a great comment about the leader and the culture. Unless you tell me otherwise, unless that leader really establishes a culture of candor, culture of where people feel not necessarily judged, and they're willing to come up and tell you, I'm struggling with this, you're going to have a hard time people just coming up and volunteering that outright. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I have had a couple employees who are pretty candid and transparent. The rest maybe are much more withholding for a longer period of time. But I have found, as I built a rapport with those employees, that generally does come into the conversation at some point. Now, I didn't pry to find those things out, but the ones who shared it came up in conversation naturally. And there's two specifically that really they wanted me to know. They wanted me to understand because of their day-to-day struggles with PTSD.
Do you believe there's still a stigma attached to this idea of mental health? And if so, why do you believe that's the case?
I actually do believe there's stigma. I think it depends on the generation. I think the older the generation, not to stigmatize that either, it's just that there wasn't as much openness as a norm. I actually have coaching clients right now that are on the younger end. I have several 21-year-olds. They are very open. They are very aware that mental health is part of their whole repertoire for self-care. So I think we're going to see that change over time, because the younger generation has no problem talking about their anxiety, their depression, their therapist, they're seeking a coach, and they're very engaged. So I think there are things that are driving that conversation to become more normal. But I think the older the person, the less likely it is to be a norm for them culturally. At least not in the past, it hasn't been.
Right. I'm dating myself, but our generation wasn't used to. Yeah, I just came from my therapist office. So how are you?
Correct.
That wasn't the conversation we would have. Talk about what top 3 trends during the past couple of years of this pandemic. And I could have swore I thought once we got a vaccine we'd be over this thing, but clearly it's going to continue to be a part of our lives. So what trends do you believe has most contributed to concerns about employee mental health?
That is a fantastic question. I think one of the most obvious ones that are bringing it up, at least as sort of we need to be aware of this, we need to be checking on this, is the isolation that the lockdowns produced. For my team, I had literally just got both of my teams in the same building, and the next week we went into lockdown. And so we hadn't even gotten to a new norm as a team. But many of those team members did not like the lockdown. They did not like being separated from their peers. Had a good mix of introverts and extroverts, but I would say across the team, most of my team wanted to be back in the building. They wanted to be back with other people because there's energy and there's things that they got. So isolation is key. I also believe that there's the other side of it. There's the resistance to come back into the office that I know other leaders struggled with in trying to get their teams back for very similar reasons. They felt safer at home. They felt like they could be more relaxed at home. They felt like they had proved their ability to work from home, and that frankly, it caused them to feel better about where they were. So there was a pretty much a mixed bag on that. And I think the third thing is just the fear surrounding the pandemic. Like, we had techs who thrived on being on the front lines and really enjoyed being part of the solution to keep the world kind of functioning. And then I think we had techs who were very uncomfortable with that, and it caused a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. But overall, I think there was this awareness of like, check on your team, see how your people are doing, make sure you're contacting them regularly. That kind of.
Unless you tell me otherwise, those three trends are going to continue, right? There's got to be some people that are going to continue to struggle because some people are really used to and been working from home for years. Others are going to continue to struggle in that they're not as productive working remote, and they needed, a chance to come in and the camaraderie and be around the water cooler and walk up and down the hall and visit with others. Conversely, there's going to be some people that listen, I don't need to deal with that hour plus commute to come in an office where I can be productive at home. And then fear around this pandemic with these various variants that kind of come around, unless you tell me otherwise, those things are going to go away anytime soon.
That's correct. And I think that it's almost, I wouldn't say it's a gridlock, but there's definitely a tension between all of those three things. And, I think long-term it's going to change the world of work as we know it. I do believe there's going to be more of a hybrid approach and a recognizing that what's right for you may not be right for me. Maybe I need to be in the office and I need that contact, and maybe you need to be at home, but maybe there's a happy medium where we can work out giving you the option and giving me the freedom to come back in the building.
For our audience, if you just joined us, you listened to Gail Sease, and we're talking about mental health and the employee experience. Gail, you brought up a great point, which is this kind of multi-generational impact on this topic. That we all intellectually certainly understand that mental health is important, but it just may not be a priority to that seasoned service leader who grew up in some ways old school of, listen, you keep your problems at home and you don't need to bring them to work. So why do you believe mental health is not as a strategic priority, if you will, for many service leaders?
I believe that, first of all, some people just don't have the experience with it. Like, it's just not been part of their life experience. They maybe haven't had any reason to have maybe more attention in that area of their life. So there's a general lack of awareness. I don't think it's because they're indifferent or because they don't care. It's just they haven't had a reason to be aware, or that's not been part of their experience. I think there's the taboo generationally. I think now my experience, especially in my area of the industry, I believe many leaders are just very busy. Like, they're just so busy. They're so overtapped. That's not even a word, but they have so much on their plate that they don't necessarily have time to have those kind of interactions and to be able to be aware on that level. So I don't think it's an intentional malice approach. I think it's general ignorance, and I mean that in the most honorable way, and just not having had any history or exposure or just need to do that. I'm more aware because of where I've been in life, and I'm just a little bit more tuned into that. I also thrive on the development side of people. So I soft skills area is my area. So I'm usually a little more tuned into that because that's where my skill set is.
So we talk, and there's a lot of that's been written about leadership. There's a lot of talk and research and insights into leadership. I'm particularly curious about if I'm a field technician, if I'm a customer service rep, if I'm a customer experience person. How do I broach this subject? How do I go to my leader and say I'm struggling, or I'm just not myself? Or again, it's easy for us to say, well, just go talk to a leader. You have any tips or advice for employees on how to do this without
That's
feeling without feeling weird about it, without feeling like I'm imposing on that already overcommitted leader?
That is a great question. Because I do think it takes a certain amount of self-awareness about your own responses to the world around you to have the awareness and perhaps the courage to have that conversation. I will tell you, I'll be forthcoming in that, my last few leaders, I was very much aware and had that conversation on my own behalf because I understood my trigger points come up in stressful situations. So if I'm completely overstressed or overcommitted or overwhelmed, maybe some of the ways I navigate are still things I'm working out in my own life. So I mean, I let them know on the front end, like you should just understand this is my background and understand that I'm working through those things, but I want you to have the openness. If you see something, you can have that conversation with me and vice versa. So I think on an individual basis, they have to have the self-awareness of what they need and realize that using their voice in that way is actually powerful and not necessarily so much vulnerable. It's recognizing what you need and then making that request from your leader. And I can tell you, the employees who've done that with me, I had great respect for their self-awareness and what they needed. I can give you an example of that actually with an employee if you maybe want to hear how that plays
Please.
itself out. So I had an employee on my team who was an Army vet. He did 4 tours in Iraq and did not deal with stress well at all. And so we were in a closed space on this particular team. It was my first team. And we had a couple of people who thrived on creating a lot of conflict, and it would trigger him. And he literally came to my office one day and he just said, you should understand, if I walk away from my desk and I go for a walk, I'm not trying to get out of responsibility. I have to get out of here where there's conflict going on because it triggers me and I need to go. I know what I need. I just need to go walk it off and come back. So is that okay with you if I do that? Absolutely.
Love it.
Yeah.
And I've heard 2 other things. So I captured self-awareness, courage, really understand what your trigger points are and communicate those. But I've also heard ask for grace from that leader of, as you said, just I need to go for a walk, or I need to kind of disengage for a minute, or can you give me, some time to kind of work through this? The other thing I've found, and others have shared, is obviously not just get the help, but perhaps create an environment for others who may be struggling for the same thing to get together.
Yes.
I think this is really difficult in isolation. So whenever you can get multiple people together and just talk about their experiences, do you believe that could be helpful?
Yeah, I do. I think that could be very helpful. I think there is a certain amount of risk involved with that, but I actually had a different employee who got triggered in front of a classroom and had to leave the classroom in the middle of a class. And he was so triggered that I actually had to coax him back in because it was just one of those situations. But what I saw, how we addressed it after that is I talked to him. I said, look, we need to reestablish some credibility with the team because you just walked out of the classroom and you haven't been here that long. So we need to reestablish some credibility. So how would you feel if I sent an email to the team, just explained a little bit of what happened and asked for their support? And they did. The team responded. I was so proud of them. They rallied around him and did their best to try to support him. And I think that you can't get what you aren't asking for. And so I think it's just everybody has things that they deal with. And I think if we have that general understanding, that we can, if we're a team, we can roll up our sleeves and try to support one another in that.
We got a great comment by John. Carol says, seems like awareness to the extensive type of mental health is a good place to start in terms of building a mental health and wellness program. From this comes recognition, identification, sympathy, empathy, and support prevention. That sounds like a great foundation.
Yes, I agree. I think if every company had that, there would be just a completely different vibe across the company. I would tell you, ITW's resources in that particular way with online training and the resources they provide in the wellness program really did kind of build that foundation. But what I think could be done off of that foundation is maybe a leader sponsoring some kind of a, hey, we're going to get together, maybe a lunch once a month or something. If anybody wants to talk about any of these kinds of things, or, gather for support or whatever. But I think it would take a leader to sponsor it.
And it goes a long way. And again, destigmatizing that it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to talk about, as you said, we all struggle. The other thing I think my parents drove into me is be kind, because you have no idea the battles that other person is fighting, right? You have no idea the struggles they're going through. So John, thank you for that comment. I encourage our audience to jump in with other questions or comments for Gail as well. Let's talk about the employee experience. How do you believe mental health impacts that employee experience?
So this is probably my largest area of passion within an organization. I did my master's research around organizational culture and climate. And so culture is a really big deal to me. And so as it relates to how mental health impacts the employee experience, is that cultures and norms affect how vulnerable or real people feel like they can be to ask for help or express need, or even to say, hey, I'm so overloaded right now. Is it possible we could shift one or two of these projects over to somebody else's plate so I can get my breath? So I think, cultural rules and norms play such a huge role here. And that's why I think there's parallels between families and organizations. Whatever the rules are, that's what people play by. And so I think some workplaces that I've been, enough places to see this. Some workplaces, the job comes with a certain amount of stress and chaos. And if you can't accept that and agree to working under those terms, it can really be detrimental to your experience in the organization. And as a matter of fact, I've probably worked more places where overwhelm was almost the norm, more than the exception. And it takes a toll on people after a while. It really does add up. And so I think maybe realizing our own idiosyncrasies and expectations around that, expecting people to, if you're not a workaholic, you're not going to make it here, right? That there's no boundaries, that, you go home at the end of the day and you actually have a weekend without answering email and phone calls. Those are rules and norms. They maybe aren't like official, right? But if you're my boss and you're emailing me at night, the message I'm getting is that you want me to respond.
You're exactly right, and I do believe those are unwritten rules that nobody puts in an employee manual, but it just seems to be the way the place functions. Gail, you're gonna appreciate this comment. I'm coaching a leader who came from a quasi-government entity, and she admits that organization moved very slow, and she would work on projects that would take years. She's recently joined a startup. and the two dichotomies couldn't be more different, right? They couldn't be. The startup can't move fast enough, and her C-suite executive asked her 6 days in, I'm assuming you're already caught up to speed, you know everything that's going on, and you're hitting the ground running. And she's literally asking me as a coach, like, I don't know if he's joking, I don't know if he's serious. I said, oh no, he's serious. Yes. I know the organization, I know the culture, and it just couldn't be more, again, just two ends of the spectrum. And I'm going to go back to something you said. Do you believe, and this is my assertion, that relationships go bad when there's misaligned expectations?
Absolutely.
B, employees don't do enough of their own due diligence on the company culture to really understand what some of those rules, written or unwritten, are, and what's expected of me if I join. So they
Yeah.
get overwhelmed because of that misaligned expectation. Have you found the same?
Absolutely. I think that is a great observation because it really is about expectations. And even in the coaching world, you can appreciate. I made this equation once on my whiteboard at Hobart. It was expectations minus reality equals disappointment. So, whatever your expectations are compared to actual reality, whatever that differentiation is in that gap, that's the level of disappointment that you're going to experience in that organization. And I would agree that the employee has as much responsibility on discerning and vetting out what those expectations are as the company does. The problem is we get stars in our eyes and we it's like that, a honeymoon phase, and we don't do proper due diligence. And I will tell you, Hobart is the one place I actually did this. So you might laugh at this, but this actually happened. So Terry Strong is the manager, the director who hired me to work for Hobart. And I'd had enough experiences I didn't appreciate when I interviewed for that job, that he made some kind of a comment about halfway into the interview to let me know he was the hire, he was the one hiring. But I was at the place I wasn't selling out anymore. So I said to him, this is 30 minutes into the interview. I said, you think that you're interviewing me right now? But you should be really aware that I'm also interviewing you. And I literally said these words. I said, because I'm not working for another stupid boss. And I know that is so, like, in hindsight, it makes me cringe a little bit. But at the same time, you know what he did? He looked at me, he sat back, and he started belly laughing. And I knew then that I could work for him, and that we were going to get along if I could be that candid about, look, this is a relationship and you might be in the power seat, but understand I have choices here too. And the expectations have to be aligned.
For some of our younger audience members, be cautious of career ending. I tell somebody else, where success comes from? Good decisions. You know where good decisions come from? Bad decisions.
That's
right?
Exactly right.
So language is important. But Gail, what a great point. And I often coach people that not just in the current incredibly tight talent market we're in, but regardless of where you are, you have to make sure you're interviewing them as much, the leader, the company, the culture, the expectations. Can you help me understand what this job looks like? What will I know 6 months from now that I don't today? Those are all great questions that I think we all should ask in every engagement, in every interaction, just to kind of minimize those misaligned expectations,
Yes.
particularly when it comes to our mental health.
Yes. And he said that was the comment that told him I could do the job that he was hiring me to do, because this team needed a culture overhaul on the team. And there were some things that came with that weren't going to be very pleasant. He said he knew when I said that I actually had the fortitude to be able to do what was needed to be done.
Sheila's sharing, it's so important that employees and leaders are aligned on expectations. I love this. Gail, I wrote it in my notes and put bold in it as well, of expectations minus reality equals disappointment. Love that. Great nugget, great tip. Thank you for that. So what are the biggest mistakes you see organizations continue to make when it comes to that employee's mental health kind of program? Mental health, it can't just be one and done. It can't just be episodic. Ideally, it becomes programmatic. What are some of the biggest mistakes you continue to see organizations make in that mental health program?
So I guess I would say I'm not sure they're necessarily making mistakes, but perhaps they're missing opportunities. Maybe they're missing opportunities to really get their hands into the people side of the business, because there's something about that feeling understood as an employee and feeling like your boss gets you. Like I found if I have an employee's heart, I have their whatever they're going to do. Like my team would fall on the sword for me if I asked them to, because they knew I cared. I knew what was going on in their life. I knew what was going on most of the time in their family. I asked questions where they knew that. And so I think the opportunity miss there is what's happening. So I don't think there's anything intentional. There's just room for them to do more. And I think two ways they could probably add to it is literally having mental health days as part of the benefits package. So you have vacation days, you have sick days. I literally think if they had like 2 mental health days where an employee could take it just because they needed a break for some reason, they just want to go spend it however they want. A mental health day, to me, that begins to sort of normalize, hey, we understand there's a need. We're actually providing for that need. And then the other thing I think would be super powerful, not to be hyperbolic, but trauma-informed leadership goes a long way. And I think a lot of times we put those high performers into leadership positions without really equipping them. And when you have a service business is pretty heavy military experience. I guarantee if you did a survey across a service team in the field, you're going to get a significant percentage of former military. But just having some trauma-informed leadership training that helps people to understand, look, if you have people with certain backgrounds, there's things that maybe create some dynamics that you could help lead better around, and mitigate.
Say more about that, because in full disclosure, I haven't heard that term, the trauma-informed leadership training. What does that entail? What does that look like?
So where this is probably most common is honestly in the social justice arena. Just because there is a lot of dealing with different types of trauma and recovery involved, especially in terms of trafficking and that kind of thing. But I think it's just helping leaders to understand when you get a team, it's in some ways, it's kind of like having a classroom of kids to some degree. And the more you understand how to interact and lead and really help lead well the people that maybe struggle with different things, that you're going to get a lot more out of them, and they're going to progress a lot faster in a shorter timeline. So what that would look like is in the same way we do diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and we heighten awareness about what that looks like and where those gaps are. I think you could do a similar kind of training on that topic, where you help leaders understand there are things that happen within a team. Like I've had a colleague commit suicide. I've had an employee walk off the job twice because of being triggered and stressed. I had somebody sent back to work that was suicidal for 2 months, literally in the office, suicidal for 2 months. There's no training that comes with that.
I'm often reminded of how many organizations take a high performer, kind of a frontline contributor, and make him a manager without really investment of kind of understanding how to manage, how to lead effectively, how to understand some of these things. So again, Sheila's got a great comment. Does your boss get you, or you're really in touch with your employees? Maybe this is something every leader and employee should ask themselves. And it goes back to your self-awareness comment, Gail, that you made is this has to start with you, but also courage to broach this subject, courage to bring it up without stigmatizing it, without really, again, continue to contribute to the narrative that it's taboo and we shouldn't talk about this. You should kind of keep your problems to yourself and not collectively everybody's. The other thing you said that really resonated with me was leaders have to demonstrate that care, not just talk about it. Because it's very easy to put up posters that we value our people, but you and I keep reading about this great resignation. They're leaving bosses. They're leaving crappy jobs. They're leaving, companies and leaders that don't care.
Yes,
not the job.
That's correct. And there are aspects of the job they don't like, but an employee who feels valued and who is doing work that plays to their strengths and that in an environment that allows them to do it with a reasonable amount of stress-free effort, they have no reason to leave, unless you're just paying them so poorly. They have no reason to leave. We know that it's easier to stay somewhere you don't like than it is to go find somewhere that you do. It just is. And so I think that just that awareness and understanding that there are things that companies really can do to hold on and provide support beyond where it is.
So let's move on to, where do you believe employee mental health and the overall experience is headed? Are there some future trends that you're watching or you're thinking about that you believe will become more prevalent as this topic kind of gains more momentum on more leaders kind of front of their mind share?
Yeah, I think there's probably a nice handful of things that would happen. First of all, I think that negotiation of working remote versus office, that's going to find a new norm. I think that people clearly do not appreciate being able to do that and then have it retracted and being sent back to the office and not wanting to. I think there's going to be a greater awareness as we move forward. I don't want to say more into the pandemic because I still have my fingers crossed this is going to end at some point, but there's going to be greater awareness. I will tell you, millennials and Gen Z I think there's a Gen Y in there somewhere too, but those younger generations, they're going to push this topic because they have no shame about it. And for that, I really appreciate that. Where I think they could run into the ditch, and I've done a little bit of thinking about this, is a lot of times, it's great to not have shame around a topic, but there's another thing when you define yourself by the topic, right? So I may have anxiety. I am not anxiety. I may have, ADHD or depression or whatever, but that doesn't define who I am. So I think there's probably some mistakes that'll be made too, but I think the norms are going to change with those younger generations. And as a result, I think that there's going to be probably more of an expectation of some empathy training for leaders, just to be tuned in and being able to provide some basic empathy for situations. And to be fair, the millennials and the younger generations, they have far more they're dealing with than we ever did. And I saw this happen when I was raising my girls, and high schoolers, by the time they got to 10th grade, they started bailing on sports programs. They were so burned out. They had been in t-ball, preschool, gymnastics, you name it, since they were 2 or 3 years old. By the time they got to 10th grade, they were worn out. So they just said no more. So I think that's going to drive some of this conversation, where an expectation, empathy, and more support.
I have got to tell you, I was taken back by the, in some ways, polar opposites of the reaction with the Olympic athletes. I think the gymnast, I apologize, I forget her name, but the gymnast who literally bowed out of the competition, and there was Simone Biles, and then the tennis star that also left the tournament of just, I needed to focus on my mental health. And you had a lot of people that understood that. By the way, the gymnast is doing unnatural acts in the air, and if she can't concentrate or she's she's not there, right, it could end in catastrophic events. And then there's some people like I said, pull up your pants, you're an Olympian, go. And it just, you saw very two ends of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. And as you're talking, I can't help but think the exact same thing is happening in our companies, right? Some are saying, I get it, go do what you need to take care of yourself because we want the best of you to come to work every day. Others are thinking, stop making excuses, get to work, get it done.
Yeah, suck it up and do it.
Right? How do you really bridge that? How do you bridge those very opposing perspectives, again, into that unified culture?
Yeah, I think that will be the problem to solve, to be honest. I think that's, again, it's a negotiation of new cultural norms and basic understanding. I think it's hard to have empathy if you don't see a need for it and you've never experienced the need for it. And I think that, I'll be honest, I think what I've walked through in life has made me a better leader. I think I would be an awful leader. And I'm not saying I'm the best leader. I'm saying that I would not be the leader I've been if I hadn't gone through what I've gone through, because it has forced me to look at these areas where I wouldn't have had a reason to do that. So I think it's going to be negotiated. I don't think we can necessarily forecast that, but it's an interesting dichotomy. And I think how you lay that out is definitely the two schools of thought. But I would just add, in coming up to this interview, I have several very experienced field leaders that I'm pretty close with that are regional ops managers. we had this conversation. I had it with 3 of them. And probably the average of experience between the 3 is well over 30 years each. But what I found is they have great empathy for their teams. All 3 of them would go to the mat for their teams. Like, they are people leaders who value people and who seek to understand and try to accommodate. So I think that will be the way to the negotiation.
I absolutely agree that I think, especially again, and maybe it is the tight talent market that's going to drive more leaders to pay attention to this topic, to prioritize this topic. So Sheila's got a great comment. I know one of the Service Council members, a global leader, that took it upon himself to call his employees within his team out of the blue when he saw them online just to check in. He did this every day and made sure he contacted everyone over a period of time, no matter where they were. He made sure they knew he cared just by simply checking in on an individual basis. Right? Love that. Love that.
Wow.
In lieu of us meeting in person in office, why not reach out one-on-one and just check? And I love this question. How's your head? How's your heart?
Yeah.
Right? To really get them engaged, hopefully open up and be able to broach that topic and have people, talk to you about how they're feeling, how they're thinking.
Yeah, agreed. And I think a leader that's that in touch with their team and takes that little bit, I guarantee that he has probably not a lot of turnover in his team. I bet you they would roll up their sleeves under many adverse circumstances to win. And that's the thing I see that's rich about the service business, though. So to kind of focus on that for a second, is the service business is the people business. And if you're in the service business and you don't love people, you are in the wrong industry. Go to, not to be offensive, but go to IT, go to something that's much more like, but the people business is, I've met so many wonderful people leaders in the people business, but I've also met some awful leaders who didn't like people. And I'm like, move on down the road. You're in the wrong business.
Yeah, and I don't think that I call it dinosaur leadership. I don't think that dinosaur leadership is going to last. By the way, another friend who just accepted a senior leadership position, you talked about negotiation and kind of in the hybrid work, wrote in her contract, this position will be permanently remote. So she wasn't going to have them come back after this pandemic and say, sorry, we need you to move to, in this case, it was another city. But we're seeing increasingly more and more the demand for, listen, I'm happy to commute. I'm happy to come visit. I'm happy to really, contribute, but I'm not moving. I'm not displacing my family. I'm not adding unnecessary kind of stress to my life. So on that note, are there some top advice you would have for field service, customer support, customer experience professionals, and how to prioritize mental health?
So if I'm talking to an individual, I would say take it seriously. First of all, it's a serious thing. Mental health is your health. If you are not mentally healthy, if you're not practicing consistent self-care, you're going to end up either with some physical ailments that make you pay attention, or you're going to end up completely burned out. And even if you're practicing self-care, you can end up burned out. And that's how I even got to do this interview was, I believe John saw the video I did on burnout. But take it seriously before you find yourself in a bad place. Take care of both your brain and your mind, and they're two different things. Your brain is an organ, and there are things that you must do to care for it, just like you do your physical body the rest of the way. But caring for your thought life and where you let your mind go is really the other half of that. And then third, I think, know that there's no shame in talking about mental health. We are mental, emotional beings. This is how we're made. And we live in a body, right? But we are a soul. We live in a body. And to only focus on wellness as a physical outcome and not a mental outcome is a huge oversight. So there's no shame. We are emotional beings. And there are chemicals that make our brain work or not work. And if you're missing them, then you start to suffer. So that's what I would say to an individual. I do have some things I would offer to teams, though, that are more general. And I will tell you, I aggregated these from the field service leaders. So these are not mine specifically, but these are what these gentlemen shared. Number one is to be available to your leaders and your teams. show that you care and take time to know them. And it doesn't take that long to know somebody. It doesn't take a lot to have a conversation and get to know people a little bit. Number 2, communicate early and often and pivot where you need to. So a lot of the reason people make up stories and start to draw conclusions about things that aren't even going on, but, create the grapevine, is the absence of communication. So I think, as leaders, we can always improve communication. 3, accommodate schedules and family needs as much as possible with healthy boundaries and accountability. And a specific example of that for me on my team, I have 2 people on my team that have spouses that are organ recipients. So when the virus started, spreading, came to the U.S., we knew that they needed to stay home because we didn't want them to expose themselves and get their spouse sick and end up dying. So that's one example of pivoting. Like, I already knew they're going to do their work. I know the quality of their work, so I could accommodate that. 4, make sure they have what they need to work successfully. Do they have all the PPE they need? Do they have the expectations? We think of, having what they need in terms of physical property, but man, expectations go a long way. Here's what I'm expecting by when, here's what it would look like, just expectations. And then 5, help them realize they're on a team and they're not alone. And 6, and ITW did a fantastic job of this. Create as much job security as you can to mitigate their fear and stress. And one of the things that ITW did, and we were watching all kinds of companies shed people really immediately when the lockdown started in March of 2020. Like, they were shedding them by the thousands. But ITW did not do that. They did not shed any technicians. And that created a lot of, ability to kind of roll with what was happening. So, make sure they feel secure in their job.
Gail, I got to tell you, I love this. This is a great list for leaders to, I'd put this list up in my office or on my wall or somewhere and just make sure I look at it on a regular basis and build some sort of cadence to follow it. And for our audience, we'll share these on the Service Council blog and in the show notes of this episode. But these are great tips for the leaders to really think about and proactively nurture. So how can the Service Council audience learn more about you and your work?
Okay, so I'm full-time coaching since October the 1st, and I have a nice slate of clients, and I'm open to more, but I would love to just have conversations too. They can find me on my website is www.gailsease.com, and that's just GAILSEASE. And then my email, they can reach me by email. It's SEASEKG @gmail.com. K is in Karen, G is in Gail. Yes, my first name is Karen and I wear it proudly. And then, lastly, just know that I'd love to discuss any interest they have in this topic or coaching and any concerns they have or needs they want to discuss. So
I'm being asked for the summary of the tips for the leaders. So if I could just recap: number 1, be available, show you care, and make time to get to know them. 2, communicate early and often, pivot as necessary. 3, kind of accommodate schedules and family needs. 4, kind of better understand what they need to work successfully, kind of expectations, align those. 5, help them realize they're on a team and not alone. 6, create as much job security as possible. So those are great tips for leaders. For our audience, you've been listening to Gail Sease, fantastic background in the customer service, customer experience, documentation, technical training space. We're talking about mental health and customer experience. Gail, thank you for both the gift of your time and your insights. This has been invaluable, and I think more and more leaders, either by choice or by necessity, are going to have to spend more time on both understanding mental health and some of the insights you shared, like trauma-informed leadership training, but also listen more proactively, listen more intently.
Yeah.
I believe to not just what the employees are saying, but what they're not saying.
Yes.
They're struggling to share.
Yes.
And I think that will continue to help them realize that these individuals are by far their biggest asset. So On behalf of Service Council, thank you for being our guest. Our audience, thanks
you.
for watching. Thanks for joining us. Absolutely. Sheila shared Gail's website. Please visit Gail's website. We'll also put this in show notes.
Okay.
Join us again on the first and third Thursday of each month. We're going to have fabulous guests from the tech sector. Service Council has a technology advisory board. We have some great folks from that group. Of course, the regular advisory board, there's some great service leaders that are also going to be our future guests. Please join us. Gail, make it a great rest of your week.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, everybody. All the best.
Bye-bye.